Good morning or good evening, depending on where you are located right now. My name is Chintan Sutaria, and this is Lighthouse Prep's first ever 20-minute GMAT drill. Today, we're going to be covering critical reasoning, and specifically, we're going to focus on a skill to identify conclusions within the passage. So, without further ado, let's get started. If you haven't ever been to a 20-minute drill before, here's a quick introduction of what we're going to cover. We're going to go over an introduction of what is the 20-minute drill, then we do a concept overview followed by some practice questions, and finally at the end we have some time for some optional Q&A, so that might go beyond the 20 minutes depending on how many questions are asked. But let's get started with the overview then. So in a 20-minute drill, we cover one concept, and I want to be very clear about this. We don't want to go into a lot of depth, right? Because 20 minutes is not enough time to have a lot of depth of conversation. So what I'd like to suggest here is use the 20-minute drill as an introduction to the concept. So learn a little bit about the concept, and then from there go on and do some additional practice. Apply the skill that we talk about in this 20-minute drill to some practice problems, and maybe read a little bit more about it so you get some more in-depth understanding. After we go over that concept overview, we're going to look at 3 problems and go over them in pretty great amount of detail so you kind of understand the thought process that goes into answering these problems. And finally, we're going to do some Q&A. So remember, the big takeaway here is this is only an introduction to a GMAT topic, and it's highly suggested you go do some additional practice afterwards. Okay, so before we go into a critical reasoning problem, it's very important we understand what strategy needs to be approached on all types of critical reasoning problems. So here I have outlined the 4 steps that I use to solve critical reasoning problems. The first one is to start off by reading the question stem. The question stem is that one sentence question that follows the passage in a critical reasoning type question. After you read the question stem, you should think of keywords that are located in the question stem that help you identify how the question is going to be structured and the answer choices are going to be structured. We'll go over that later in the practice questions also. Next, you should read the passage. The passage is usually about 150, 200 words or so, but as you're reading the passage, you're not reading it for the details of the content or things like that. You're reading it with an eye to the content, but a focus on the parts of the argument, right? So we want to be able to break apart what are they trying to tell us, categorize it, classify, is this a claim, is this a premise, is this a conclusion, what is this that they're telling us, right? After you read the passage, you want to identify the conclusion, and that's what we're going to be going over today is how can you identify a conclusion. It's very important that you do identify the conclusion. And then finally, you want to use a process of elimination in selecting the correct answer choice. The reason that I say you have to use a process of elimination is because in the verbal section of the GMAT, it's not about which question is right. It's about which is the best question out of the answer choices given to you. A lot of times this will happen where you think answer choice A is the correct one, but answer choice B might be more specific and exact to what you're looking for. So remember, always be able to eliminate the other answer choices before settling on one of them. Okay, now the other important thing that we need to cover before we get into critical reasoning, identify the conclusion skill, is being able to understand the parts of an argument. So an argument, as the GMAT reads it, is not 2 people fighting with each other. No, an argument is a very structured approach to persuading you of something, right? And it consists of 3 parts. The first part is the premise. So let's look at an example of what a premise might look like. A premise here is the iPhone 6 has a big screen. The iPhone 6 has a big screen. Okay, that's a premise. Well then, what does that lead us to believe, right? It leads us to believe that the iPhone 6 is better than the iPhone 5. But can you really conclude from the iPhone 6 has a big screen that the iPhone 6 is better than the iPhone 5? No. You need something in the middle there, right? What is that thing in the middle? It's the assumptions. The assumptions are things that are sometimes even plugged in automatically by our brain without us thinking about it. But it's very important on the GMAT critical reasoning arguments that you don't let your brain automatically fill in some assumptions, because that's usually where the traps lie. So the assumptions here might be, for example, a bigger screen means a better phone, right? Because some people might not like having a bigger screen. And that other flaws don't outweigh the benefits of a bigger screen. So for example, you can't conclude that the iPhone 6 is better than the iPhone 5 without knowing what other features or benefits it offers, right? It might have less battery life, or it might have worse reception, or it might be a less stable design. Any of those things could apply. So the key takeaway here is that there are three key parts of an argument in critical reasoning: the premise, the assumption, and the conclusions. And it's important to be able to identify all three of those as you read a passage. Now, we're going to go into the three strategies to identify the conclusion. Now, this is the most important part of what we're covering today, so focus in. Okay, so the first strategy is to find keywords that indicate a conclusion. Here's a list of keywords that are commonly used to identify conclusions. So if you see any of these keywords, usually after the keyword is the conclusion. So here's an example. Using our previous iPhone scenario, the iPhone 6 has a big screen. Accordingly, it is better than the iPhone 5. You see how the word accordingly there implies that the iPhone 5 is better, is the conclusion, right? That's the next step of the logic path. But sometimes you're going to get a passage where the word accordingly or clearly or consequentially or any of these other words are not listed in the passage. So how are you supposed to identify the conclusion in that situation? Well, the other option is that you can insert keywords, right? So if you were to have a passage like this, the iPhone 6 is a big screen. It is better than the iPhone 5. Well, you can put in your own keywords. So for example, you could put in accordingly, even if it's not provided for you. Or you could put in clearly, or you could put in therefore, or any of these other words, and see if it makes sense. And if it does make sense, then great, you're on the right track. If it doesn't, then you might want to consider flipping the sentence, or you might want to consider looking at a different sentence in the passage, or any of the other question stem, answer choice, things like that. And finally, if neither one of these works, then what might be easier for you is to convert it into an if-then statement. So if you have a passage like this, right, the iPhone 6 has a big screen, it is better than the iPhone 5, then you can convert it into a logic path. You can sequence the logic there so that it makes more sense by doing if-then statements. So if the iPhone 6 has a big screen, then it is better than the iPhone 5. You can see how that puts it in a sequence of logic for you. And the last part of the sentence, the then clause, is your conclusion, and the if clause is your premise. So let's try out these three approaches to identifying the conclusion using our practice questions. Starting with practice question one. Now remember, if you didn't get a chance to look at these questions before the 20-minute drill started, it's okay. We're going to go over them in a lot of detail here, but in the future it might be helpful to you to look at the questions or attempt to solve them before you come to the 20-minute drill so that you can be better prepared with questions when you come here. Okay, so let's start with practice question one now. We're going to start with the question stem because remember, that's our path. We start with the question stem, then the passage, then identifying the conclusion, then eliminating the answers. So starting with the question stem. Which of the following, if true, most weakens the conclusion drawn above? Well, okay, so the key words we're looking for here, I see a couple of them. One is weakens, right? So we want something that's going to weaken the conclusion, not strengthen the conclusion. So our answer choices have to be something that go against the conclusion identified. And the second is conclusion drawn above. What that tells you is that the conclusion is in the passage. It's not in the answer choices, it's not in the question stem, it's clearly in the passage. So now we can move on to the passage. Okay, so looking at the passage, long distance runners sometimes get shin splints from overtraining. Shin splints are also common among freestyle skiers. Freestyle skiers are also guilty of overtraining. So in critical reasoning passages and even reading comprehension passages on the GMAT, you get a lot of wasted fluff words that don't really add a lot of value to what you're trying to distill the argument down to. So here I'm going to go over first and just simplify the sentences. So the first sentence, what I see as the key words here are runners, right? I don't care about long distance runners or short distance runners. I just see runners get shin splints from overtraining. That's the gist of what they're trying to tell us. In the second sentence, shin splints are common amongst freestyle skiers. That's all I care about there. And in the third sentence, skiers overtrain. That's all I care about in that sentence, right? So now I'm going to break apart each sentence and see how it links into a structured argument, right? So the first one, I'm going to try the therefore test. Since I don't see any keywords, I'm going to insert keywords. So I'm going to put in, therefore, long-distance runners sometimes get shin splints from overtraining. Well, that doesn't make any sense. Therefore, from what, right? So that one is clearly not our conclusion. Our second sentence, shin splints are also common among freestyle skiers. This one also doesn't make as much sense because there's no link between the first sentence and the second sentence. So can you really conclude the second thing from the first thing? No. So therefore, shin splints are common among freestyle skiers doesn't make sense. Now on to the third sentence. The third sentence says, therefore, freestyle skiers are also guilty of overtraining. Well, this seems like a candidate because in the first sentence you established runners get shin splints from overtraining. In the second sentence, you establish another independent sentence, which is shin splints are common among freestyle skiers. But the third sentence ties it all together and gives you something you can conclude through those linked sentences, right? It says, long-distance runners get shin splints from overtraining. Shin splints are common among freestyle skiers. Therefore, freestyle skiers are also guilty of overtraining. They're drawing a conclusion there. Okay, so now that we've identified our conclusion, we can go into our answer choices and start eliminating. Let's start with answer choice letter A. A says sprinters are also prone to getting shin splints. Well, our conclusion, remember what our objective here is to weaken the conclusion. Our conclusion is about freestyle skiers are also guilty of overtraining. Well, sprinters has nothing to do with that. So we would eliminate this just because it doesn't affect whether or not freestyle skiers are overtraining. So we eliminate that. On to answer choice B, we see that freestyle skiers often exhibit other signs of overtraining, such as dehydration. So freestyle skiers often exhibit other signs of overtraining is the key word there, right? Well, what this is it's a trap answer because if you didn't pay attention to the question stem says what weakens the conclusion drawn above, right? Well, if there's other signs of overtraining for freestyle skiers, that only strengthens the conclusion that they are in fact overtraining, right? So if you're getting dehydration on top of shin splints, then you can be more sure that you are overtraining. So because it goes in the opposite direction of what we want, we're going to eliminate this one. Okay, so on to answer choice C. Answer choice C says long-distance runners are less prone to long-term stress injuries. Well, again, this doesn't tell us anything about freestyle skiers because long-distance runners don't relate in any way to freestyle skiers here. So we eliminate this one. On to answer choice D. Freestyle skiers get shin splints from landing jumps incorrectly. Okay, so this one seems like a candidate for us because it says you can get shin splints from something else. Remember, our conclusion was drawn from the premise that shin splints are common among freestyle skiers, just like they are among long-distance runners. And because long-distance runners are guilty of overtraining, so are freestyle skiers. Well, what this is saying is there's an alternate cause here. There's something else that can also cause shin splints that is not overtraining. So it could cast doubt on whether or not overtraining is the reason, is the cause of shin splints, or shin splints are the cause of overtraining. So we can keep this one for now and move on to answer choice D, because remember, we still want to eliminate all other answer choices before we settle on D. Answer choice E says, freestyle skiers on average train fewer hours than do long distance runners. Well, that doesn't really tell you anything because the word fewer here, is that really defining whether or not overtraining is happening, right? Because overtraining could be training 2 hours a day, and freestyle skiers still train an hour less than long-distance runners, but long-distance runners are training 20 hours a day. So this is where taking something to the extreme will help you see whether or not it answers the prompt, right? So does it weaken the conclusion? No, because we don't really know what fewer hours means in terms of overtraining. So we eliminate this one. And because we've eliminated 4 answer choices, we can settle on answer choice D being correct. Okay, now we're going to go on to question number 2. Question number 2 says, question number 2, we're going to start with the question stem. So the question stem says, which of the following, if true, most weakens the conclusion drawn above about the number pi? Now again, we're going to look for the keywords. So there's some keywords that are the same as the previous question too. So weakens is still there, right? So we want something that's going to weaken the conclusion. Conclusions drawn above, meaning we know it's in the passage. But there's a third part to this that's also very important. They're clarifying for you which conclusion that you're going to be looking for. You're going to be looking for the conclusion about the number pi. So the number pi is what we're going to be concerned with in terms of which conclusion we want to draw. Okay, now let's go on to the passage. The passage says, the mathematical constant e, the base of the natural logarithm, is transcendental and is therefore irrational. Okay, now you see what they did here is they made a very complex passage, but you don't care about the natural logarithm, and don't confuse yourself with the mathematical side of it, right? All you care about is the logic path. So let's distill the sentence down to what we really care about. What we care about is, it says E, which is something, we don't know what, right? That thing is transcendental and is therefore irrational. E is transcendental, therefore irrational. Just think of it in terms of a variable and don't try to remember what E actually is. Okay, now on to the second sentence. The second sentence says, in 1882, the mathematician Johann Heinrich Lambert proved that the number pi is irrational. Okay, what do we care about in this sentence? Well, we don't care about the mathematician or the name of the mathematician or the year or anything like that. All we care is pi is irrational, right? That's going to be our logic path there. And then we have a key word there, right? The word therefore is there. So we know that there's a conclusion in that. Therefore, pi must be transcendental, or pi must therefore be transcendental. So our conclusion, remember, the conclusion we care about is the conclusion about the number pi. And therefore, we're going to select that conclusion, not the first therefore, where E is irrational. No, we care about pi is transcendental. So that's our conclusion. Okay, now that we've identified the conclusion, let's go into the answer choices. Remember, we're looking for answer choices that weaken the conclusion drawn above about pi, not the one about E, but about pi. Okay, starting with answer choice A. The exact value of transcendental numbers cannot be given. Well, that's interesting. The exact value. Do we care about the exact value if all we're looking for is something to prove that pi is not transcendental? No. All they're doing is further defining what transcendental means. And you shouldn't bring in any outside knowledge, such as we don't know the exact value of pi, to answer this question. Remember, all you're supposed to look at is the words on the paper before you and the assumptions that, if the question asks about assumptions, the assumptions that lead you to the conclusion. So we can eliminate this one because it doesn't further weaken our conclusion. On to answer choice B. The number square root of 2 is irrational but not transcendental. Okay, so if you look at the logic paths here, right, for E, we said E is transcendental and therefore irrational. Whereas for pi, we flipped it. We said pi is irrational and must therefore be transcendental. So E is transcendental, therefore irrational. Pi is irrational, therefore transcendental. Well, this logic in the answer choice here is giving you a counterexample of square root of 2 is irrational, but not transcendental. So that's a counterexample to pi, not to E. And therefore, I think it does weaken the conclusion. So I'm going to keep that one for now, but still eliminate some of the other answer choices. Let's look at answer choice C. The mathematician Bernard von Lindemann used the fact that E is transcendental to prove that pi is transcendental. Well, first of all, I don't care about the name of the mathematician. All I care about is what logic path did he use, right? So he used the fact that E is transcendental to prove that pi is transcendental. Well, one, he's proving that pi is transcendental. Well, we don't want to do that, right? It's strengthening our conclusion. So that's one reason to eliminate it. But the second reason is that it's not going against the logic path of the passage, where because pi is irrational, it must be transcendental. So we can eliminate this one for those reasons. Now on to answer choice D. It says the number square root of 3 is transcendental but not irrational. Well, what that's doing is it's following the logic path. Remember, there's two opposite logic paths, right? E is transcendental and therefore irrational, and pi is irrational, therefore transcendental. Well, answer choice D is following the logic path of E, not pi. And so, yes, they're providing a counterexample, but not one that is related to pi. They're providing a counterexample to the first part of the passage. So we can eliminate this because it's not in the same logic path. And finally, answer choice E says it is extremely difficult to prove that a number is transcendental. Well, whether or not it's difficult to prove that a number is transcendental doesn't matter here. All we care about is, must pi be transcendental? And regardless of whether it's difficult or not, This doesn't address the conclusion, so therefore we can eliminate E. And because we've eliminated 4 answer choices, now we can choose answer choice B to be the correct answer. Okay, on to question number 3. We're going to start with the question stem again. So it says, which of the following expresses the conclusion of the argument? Okay, so here we're going to look for the keywords in the question stem. And to me, the keyword here is expresses the conclusion. So they're telling you to look for a conclusion in the answer choices. You might find something in the passage also, but what they're saying is find something in the answer choices, right? Well, for these types of questions, what's really important to remember is the GMAT doesn't want you to think too much outside the box. You don't want to go too far in concluding things. You want to focus on the limited knowledge that you're going to have from the passage. And the best way to do that is to find a conclusion in the passage or the question stem, and then find the same conclusion worded slightly differently in the answer choices. So let's go to the passage now. The passage says, political commentator, and that's just used to give you some kind of context as to where this passage came from. In order for democracy to flourish, it is essential that political and journalistic freedom of expression exists. Okay, so here they're saying, for democracy to flourish, freedom of expression must exist. Next, even if commentators voice ideas that do not support the current government, a society is strengthened by the variety of views expressed. So they're saying, even if you don't support the government, society becomes stronger. Next, yet, our government continues to exercise a stranglehold on certain forms of speech. So yet is a key word here because it's flipping the direction of the passage, right? Here, up to this point, they've been saying it's important for people to be able to voice their opinion, it's important to democracy, and then they're saying, yet, our government is doing the opposite of that, right? So here's where the turning point of the passage starts. It is essential that the government loosen its control on the media. Well, here's where it's getting to the call to action, right? They're saying, government, loosen your control on the media. And I think this sounds like a conclusion because they're saying democracy requires freedom of expression. Even if it's bad things about the government that are being said, society becomes stronger because of the variety of views. But the government continues to stranglehold certain forms of speech. Therefore, it's important for government to loosen its control because it needs to loosen its control for democracy to flourish. And then the last sentence says, despite its potential short-term instability, this may cause the country, it will strengthen the long-term health of the country. This sounds like it's just further supporting the call to action that the government needs to loosen its control on the media. So I'm going to say this is also an intermediary premise here. Okay, so if I look for conclusions, I see 2 things that are led to from something else in the passage, right? So in order for democracy to flourish, it is essential that political and journalistic freedom of expression exists. That could be a conclusion. But the thing here is this passage was written by a political commentator. And the political commentator isn't here to talk theory about democracy. They're here to have a call to action. So the second part of this of the passage, it is essential that the government loosen its control on media, sounds more like what a political commentator would say. So I'm going to say that's our conclusion. Now, because the question stem was asking us to find which of the following expresses the conclusion of the argument, we just need an answer choice that sounds similar to this one. So let's look at answer choice A. The government is exercising too much control over the media. Well, if you look at the passage, there was something about that, right, that the government is exercising. The government continues to exercise a stranglehold on certain forms of speech. So that could be something. So we're going to keep that for now because it is restating something from the passage. Answer choice B says the government needs to open the media and release its hold on certain forms of speech. Well, they definitely say that in our conclusion, right? It says it is essential for the government to loosen its control on the media, and that sounds just like the government needs to open the media and release its hold on certain forms of speech. So I'm going to keep that one also. I have 2 answer choices that I'm not sure about eliminating yet. Answer choice C says democracy requires a strong and free press. Well, the word strong there is never mentioned in the passage, right? It just says a free press. It doesn't say anything about strong. So I'm going to eliminate this one just because they're talking about strengthened society becoming stronger, but not necessarily a strong and free press. So I eliminate that. And on to answer choice D, we see even ideas not supportive of democracy can strengthen a government. Well, what they did there is they created a trap for you because in the passage, it's not saying not supportive of democracy. The passage says not supportive of the current government. So they've flipped it on you. So because of that, I'm going to eliminate this one. And answer choice E, the future of media lies in the hands of the government. Well, we don't know anything about the future of media from this passage, so I'm going to eliminate this one also. The future of media does not make sense from this passage. Okay, now we're on to answer choice A. Well, A and B. And between A and B, I see that A says it's exercising too much control over the media. Well, that's fine, but what's the conclusion? What's the passage really trying to get you to do? They're trying to have a call to action. And the call to action is that the government needs to open the media. And therefore, I'm going to eliminate A in favor of B. And so B is the correct answer I end up settling on. I'd like to thank everybody for attending the webinar today. I hope you enjoyed it. I know we went really fast over it, but in 20 minutes, that's kind of what you end up having to do. This is a pretty broad concept, so like I said, try to go back and review. Remember the three key methods you can use to identify the conclusion are: 1, to look for keywords; 2nd, to identify keywords, to insert keywords; and 3rd, to create if-then statements. If you have any questions, I'm happy to stick around after the webinar. Otherwise, I will look for you at the next 20-minute GMAT drill hosted by Lighthouse Prep. Thank you very much for attending.